This incident happened during the summer of 2015, just after I had turned 21, and to date, it is still one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. To this day, I still get creeped out when I remember it. The day after it happened, I went back to the park and I took pictures of the whole journey in the daylight to send to a friend, so I'll include them here as proof as well. One of my favorite things to do that summer was drive around late at night. As soon as the sun had dipped beneath the sky, or as soon as I clocked out from my job, I'd be in my car and ready to explore the city that I grew up in. July 9th, 2015 was one of those nights. My city's Italian-American festival was being held that week, so after getting out of an evening summer class I was taking at the time, I headed downtown to see the festival for a bit, and I met some friends. I left the festival around 10 p.m., and since I was still wide awake, I decided to go hang out in this little park that was on the shore of a local lake and listen to some music for a while. When I got there, no one was around, and the combination of the warm night air, the quiet rippling of the water from a gentle breeze, and the distant sounds and lights of the nearby city limits lighting up the edge of the horizon made for a perfect night to be out there alone. I parked near the gated entrance to the old weathered playground I had known since childhood and perched myself on one of the swings, with my headphones in and playlist blaring. I was there for about half an hour before they showed up. A set of headlights turned into the parking lot and caught my attention. I watched as a little red Saturn parked on my passenger's side, right next to the gate that I had come in. This little lakeside park is a common night fishing spot, so at first I didn't think anything of another car showing up, and I brushed it off. But after a few minutes, something in my brain told me to be aware of my surroundings. It was then that I realized for the last several minutes, the man and the woman who were the vehicle's occupants had been getting in and out of their car, talking in hushed whispers, and turning their stereo up and down as they did. At one point, they had opened their back passenger doors and were messing around in the back seat, like they were trying to unload something large. They made a concentrated effort to keep themselves in the darkness, and when I realized all of this, the hair on the back of my neck started to stand up. My brain told me to turn off my music, but keep my headphones in, and keep swinging a little bit, so they would think I was still oblivious to what they were doing. When I did, I heard the girl say something that made my blood freeze. "I think she's almost done on the swings." At that moment, I knew these people were up to something, and the realization that they had been watching me confirmed the warning bells going off in my head were not needless anxiety. I needed to get out of that park, but in order to do so, I would have to walk through the gate and past them to get to my car, and my mind was screaming at me not to go near them. Instead, I got off the swing and walked toward the back corner of the playground, where the majority of the large equipment was, and acted like I was texting someone. I hid myself from view while I tried to figure out what to do. And what I heard next made my heart drop into my stomach. A third person's voice joining their conversation. It was then that I realized that while I was busy keeping my eye on these weirdos, a second car had pulled into the parking lot, but the driver had never gotten out until now, when I was out of sight. It was an older looking woman with a raspy voice, who sounded like she had been chain smoking all of her life. And suddenly, the three of them started arguing in the darkness. I just knew I needed to get out of that park, but I didn't want to be seen. The part of the playground I was hiding in was situated up against a fence line that separated the playground and fishing area from the basketball courts and boat dock. Aiding and concealing me in the darkness was a large maple tree, whose thickly leaved branches dipped halfway to the ground, and whose trunk, thankfully, was growing on my side of the fence. I decided I was going to climb the tree, high enough to where I could at the very least saddle the fence and hop over. I did this as quickly and quietly as possible, and as I realized I was actually doing it, I was hit with a powerful combination of nerves and adrenaline that almost caused me to lose my balance and fall. Luckily, I saddled the chain link fence, which started squeaking loudly and digging painfully into my thighs through my jeans. But I didn't care. In one sweep, I was up and over the fence, free at last. Afterwards, I decided that I was going to slink around in the dark to the other gated entrance to the park by the boat dock, and then sneak my way along the road back to the entrance where I was parked. Once I was there, I was going to make a dash for my driver's side door and get in as quickly as possible, lock the doors, and get the hell out of that park. My heart was still pounding as I walked along the wet grass. But now that I was where I was at, doubts started to pop into my mind. What if I was over-exaggerating, and what if I was blowing things out of proportion, like I have a tendency to do sometimes? What if they weren't doing anything wrong? As I got closer to the main entrance, I did my best to hide myself in the shadows from the orange glow of the streetlight that illuminated the road. Just at the entrance was a large bush with a porta potty on the other side, and I quickly ducked behind it until I could work up the nerve to run to my car. The people were still there, but now they were congregating in the parking lot, with the raspy voiced lady less than 50 feet away from me, standing next to her car. Just as I was trying to figure out what to do next, I heard her say the one thing on top of everything else that I heard and experienced that night that completely took all the strength and bravery out of me. "Did you get rid of the body yet?" It was like someone punched me in the stomach with an iron fist of fear, and all the momentum I had built up just drained from my body instantly. I wasn't sure if this lady was messing with me, and even after she said it, I wasn't even sure that I actually heard what I thought I heard her say. But whatever was going on, I knew I needed to get out of there, and fast. I barely had time to think as this lady got into her car and started the engine, with the sight of her taillights in reverse, prompting me to quick and immediate action. As she started to back up and swing around to pull out the gate, I dashed across the street and up a random person's driveway, concealing myself in thick foliage as quickly as possible. I watched as both cars pulled out of the parking lot. The gold Nissan that raspy lady had been driving going right, while the red Saturn with the guy and the girl went left off into the night. As soon as I was sure both cars were out of sight, I ran full speed down the driveway and into my car, shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. Once inside, I was relieved to find that they hadn't broken in and stolen anything, and I peeled out of the park, doing no less than 50 miles per hour on the main roads home. I had gotten to the park a little after 10 p.m., and it was now 11:45 p.m. I pulled into the driveway of my house with my car still running, and I spent at least 15 minutes on the phone with the police, crying as the full realization of what had just happened hit me. The county sheriff department was sent out to search the park when I said the lady had mentioned dumping a body, but nothing was found. They called me back around 3 in the morning once they finished their investigation and had me answer a few more questions. I didn't sleep at all that night. Around 7 a.m., I called my mom as she was getting ready to go into work, telling her what happened. Normally, my mother is quick to call me out on over-exaggerating things, and I called her partially to confirm that I was indeed overreacting to what had happened the night before. But after I was done telling my tale, she got really quiet on the other end of the phone before telling me not to ever go into that park at night again. I didn't go back there for months afterwards. To this day, I don't know if anything ever came of my report, or if those people were ever caught for anything. At the time, there was a man who had disappeared from the next town over, and his story was all over the local news. A few weeks after he went missing, his body was found in a major national park, about 30 minutes from where this little park was. I still wonder about all of that to this day. This happened roughly 6 years ago, and I would have been about 26 years old at the time. I live in a small town in the mountains of southern Appalachia. If you aren't from this region, and that immediately brings to mind visions of poverty and dark hollers, well, they do exist, but the town I am from and still reside in is a university town with roughly 70,000 people. We have a number of public parks, but in recent years, the most popular is the newest, which was built on the south side of town and has a dog park, in addition to a normal playground type park for children, and numerous walking trails, some of which go through wooded areas. It isn't uncommon for people to be walking their dogs late at night. I need to describe the layout of the park a little bit in order for the story to make sense. There was a large parking lot on one end, and this is the main entrance of the park, and it is where the children's playground and the dog park are located, as well as the restrooms, etc. This lot is long, rather than wide, and stretches alongside a sidewalk that runs next to the playground. On the other end of the park, which is over some hills and through some lightly forested areas, there is a small pond and another smaller lot. This lot has a gate just like the bigger one, but it has a little area before the gate where it is common for people walking at night to park their cars. I had a friend back in those days who was an avid walker. She was a couple years older than I was, and although petite, was sort of fearless. She would very often go walking at night by herself, and her apartment at the time was sort of out in the country, but only a mile or so from this park. So sometimes she would drive out there and walk by herself at night as well. I would say things sometimes like, you should be more careful. Maybe that's just because I'm a man who was raised in the South and we're perpetually worried about the females in our lives. She was fairly enlightened and would get angry when I would say something like this. None of this is to say I told you so, by the way. I'm just trying to paint a picture. Anyways, long story short, I started meeting her some evenings and walking with her, figuring a bearded 6'1" and 250-pound man would be a deterrent to most creepers. So one night we were walking, and while there were usually a few people in the park, it wasn't super late. It was late fall, and the nights were starting to come a little bit quicker. It seemed like maybe it was around 8 p.m., But like I said, it's been 6 years. Anyways, I had a rental car that week, luckily as it turned out, because of some work being done on my car, and I had parked behind the gate on the wooded side of the park. As we came through the woods and rounded a hill towards the main entrance of the park, I sort of clocked a van in my peripheral vision that was pulling in the gate of the park, which for whatever reason had not yet been closed. The Parks and Rec employees in my town are sort of notorious for not being strict enforcers on the closed at dusk rule. The weird thing about this was that it was sort of a cliche creeper van. It was an older model Chevy with no windows in the back, a mottled rust and paint job, and dark tinted windows in the front. For a lot of you, depending on where you live, I'm sure this might already be raising alarms, but in Tennessee, that is like every fifth car on the road. As we walked up the sidewalk parallel to the lot, the van turned behind us and then drove slowly past us on our left, coming almost to a stop, then speeding up to circle around ahead of us at the end of the lot. At this point, obviously I was paying closer attention. Now the van was coming back toward us, and the driver's side window was down. This would be the part where a lot of naysayers will probably think I'm making this up, because the man staring at us from that van was about the closest thing to a cliche creep I could think of. He was large and even bigger than me, with weird aviator-style glasses that may have been sunglasses, but were transparent enough that you could still see his eyes. He was wearing a hat and a camo-style coat, and he had a black mustache. He idled not 10 feet from us, just staring at us expressionless for a moment. We both sort of stopped and stiffened and looked back at him. There was something about his gaze, some cold-hearted malevolence, the likes of which I hadn't really ever felt in my life, which immediately chilled me to my bones. I have read articles about sociopaths and psychopaths, where scientists theorize that the reason we feel uneasy in their presence is tied into an ancient biological response from the times when truly we were their prey, and they were predators among human groups and tribes. But I felt that in that moment. I felt like I was out in the wild, naked on the tundra, and he was zeroing in on me. It was this feeling more than anything that elevated this moment for me, from merely dealing with a creep to something that was perhaps far more sinister. I grabbed my friend by the arm and said roughly, "Let's go," and started quickly across the field toward the series of hills and trees that were between us and the car, leaving the sidewalk behind. She was shocked at first and followed quickly. We half walked and half ran a few hundred yards, before realizing that the van had pulled out of the lot behind us and disappeared. My adrenaline was still pumping, and we had a quick conversation, basically consisting of, "What in God's name was that?" and "Let's get back to the car and get out of here." We quickly moved through the woods and started back down the hill. As it descends toward the lot, there were a couple of wide, sweeping switchbacks with some trees and shrubs alongside. We crested the hill and could see the lot below, and what we saw there made my blood stop pumping for a moment. Behind my rental car, the Chevy van was parked, with his bright lights shining on the car and up the hill a little ways. We hid behind some foliage and watched as he switched his headlights on and off for a minute or two. Then he pulled back a bit and shined his brights further up the hill. He sat there for a long moment as we cursed the fact that we had left our cell phones in the car, tried to decide what to do. Of course, he abruptly peeled out of the lot and took off down the road, which I did not mention before is a 2-lane country road with not much on it but cow fields and trees. We took off running down the hill toward the car and were now just outside the ring of trees near the lot when he suddenly swings back in. Luckily, we were near cover and got behind a tree, just up the hill from him. Again, he started shining his brights off and on into the trees. At this point, I was thinking I was going to have to attack him or something to try and draw him away long enough for my friend to escape. Fear, adrenaline, and anger all converged in me like a dark river, and I was probably seconds away from bursting out from the tree and taking a run at him when he once again peeled out of the lot as fast as he could. Well, he didn't have to tell us twice. We sprinted the remaining distance to the rental car and jumped in. I took off and went about 60 miles per hour down the road until we got into a neighborhood. I never saw the van on the road. In fact, I didn't see any cars until we got to a main road. I have no idea where he went. If he was sitting somewhere off the road, waiting or what. We got back to her apartment and my friend told me that, at long last, she would accept a can of mace if I ever wanted to give her one. We had a good laugh at that, but we were desperately shaken. We decompressed and talked it over a while, and I agreed to contact the police the next day. I went down to the station and told an officer what happened, but I never heard anything else about it. I have no idea what he wanted. Maybe he was a pervert. Maybe he was a good old boy that just didn't like the idea of people in the park after dark. But that look he gave me when he was idling next to us makes me think we were pretty lucky to get away. Whatever his intentions, I would surely be glad to never meet him again. At the time this happened, I was only a 13-year-old girl. This happened 2 years ago when I was fairly naive. I was a major introvert, only friends with a few people in my class. I wanted to be social, but I preferred to be alone and read or write. Classic nerd things. In early November, I got a text on my phone. It was a group chat, asking if we wanted to hang out at night near a park at our school. My parents, being strict and paranoid, would never let me go. Luckily, or what I thought was luck, they were heading out for an overnight trip, and they would be back around 4 in the morning. Everything fell into place for me. Once my parents left around 8 o'clock, I ran out the door and made my way to the park. The one thing I made sure to do was lock the door, because my parents were paranoid after all, and it was their biggest thing that they engraved into me. Once I arrived at the park, I noticed a creepy figure near the edge of the woods. No one else seemed to notice it, and I already thought I had enough reputation as a weirdo who was too much into true crime, and I didn't mention it. The night drew on, and I was having the time of my life, ignoring the gut feeling I had telling me to run. Every so often I would look over my shoulder, and the man would still be standing there. Around 10 o'clock, 4 out of the 10 people there had to leave due to their curfew. It was getting cold and was nearly pitch black with a few lit streetlights every so often. The rest of us decided to go as well, since it felt more eerie and quiet. The place we were hanging out at was a field that was fenced in with a few exits and entrances. A large wide field with a small park in the back and our giant middle school behind us. The front of the field faced the empty road, and the right and left sides were surrounded by forest. All the people left were getting picked up by cars. The man from earlier that I saw stood by the right part of the forest and road exit that I needed to take to get home. I walked away from my group and I tried to steady my heavy breathing. I didn't want to be paranoid, but all the true crime I listened to was catching up to me. The man was probably early 40s to late 30s, dark hair with a beard. Probably only around 5'9", but at the time it seemed like 6 foot or more. He stood about 10 feet from the exit I had to take, so when I got close enough to it, I ran for about 30 feet through the exit and through the woods. Once I finally felt safe enough, I started to quickly walk through the woods. I heard a snap and a crunch from behind me. I stopped walking for a second and quickly checked over my shoulder. Around 15 feet behind me stood the very same man. He was walking slowly behind me, almost as if he was trying not to be suspicious, but it only made my fear worse. I turned around and walked so quickly, I was basically jogging. I lived about 10 minutes away from the park that we had hung out at, and I wasn't necessarily athletic enough to run home. After around 7 minutes of walking fast, I was in my neighborhood. I knew that I could run to my house now if I had to, so I checked to see if he was still trailing behind me. To my horror, he was only 20 yards away. So I ran, faster than I've ever. I could hear his footsteps behind me thumping across the concrete as he ran too. I rushed down an alleyway I knew well and tried to lose him in a park, making my way home longer. I could hear his heavy breath followed by his footsteps as he tried to keep up. I cut through the houses, backyards, and front yards, and I finally made it to my house and flew up the steps. I looked behind me and he had just arrived at the bottom of my stairs as I unlocked the door and bursted through it, shoving it closed behind me, and I heard him hit the door with his whole body. I ran around the house and locked all of the windows, turned off all the lights, and I hid in my bedroom with a kitchen knife, just in case he got in. But he didn't, luckily. If this was a better world, that would be where my story would end, but it doesn't. After a few months, I hadn't really told anyone what happened since I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents for sneaking out. I didn't go out with anyone after this, and my loner status returned. I began to write horror stories as a coping mechanism, and I never went out past 7 o'clock. It was around February when a classmate of mine was sharing a story of some random man following her home from the bus. She described him almost the exact same as the man who had chased me home. Even another girl mentioned that he sounded like the guy who stood outside the school and tried to follow her home once. I didn't join in, but everyone agreed that this guy was just weird. He was kind of forgotten, and eventually I moved on too. But around May, I was getting ready to walk to school when my mom pulled me aside and showed me a picture of a man. The guy who stalked me, actually. She told me that he'd been arrested 2 weeks ago for sexually assaulting a child and had escaped last night. She told me to keep an eye out for him and to call the cops if I saw him. I was shaking the whole time I walked to school. It haunts me to know that if he had caught me, I would most likely be in her position, or even dead.